Good evening, everyone, and thank you so much for joining this important discussion today. My name is Jade Curtis, Executive Editor of BDO and moderator for this evening. Today is a momentous day as we celebrate the 60th anniversary of the Civil Rights Act, a landmark that not only dismantled segregation, but also opened doors for countless Black Americans in medicine, ensuring equal access to quality healthcare. In line with the spirit of equality, we're here to discuss the FDA's new guidelines aimed at increasing Black participation in clinical trials. These guidelines require companies to submit a diversity action plan to ensure that new treatments are tested adequately within our community. As we reflect on the progress made since the Civil Rights Act, we honor the legacy of those who fought for equality and continue to strive for justice and health equity. Joining us today, we have an esteemed panel of experts with us. Starting off with Jeannie Rignanti, CEO and founder of Patient 3i LLC and Health Equity Advisor for Tiger Lily Foundation. Elaine Palmer, Director of Clinical Operations at Pivotal Clinical Research. Dr. Randall Morgan, Executive Director at the Cobb Institute. And Lali Leo, Contract Clinical Research Management and Associate. So I want to thank you all so much for joining us, and I'm so pleased to have you. So let's dive into this very important discussion. So to kick us off, Dr. Randall, what are the main objectives of the FDA's new Diversity Action Plan?
Well, good evening, Jade, and to all of my fellow panelists. Look forward to a very enlightening discussion. The action plan is a very important element that the FDA has just introduced in follow-up to the FDORA Act of 2022. This is sort of the second foot, the implementation. And it focuses upon enrollment increase and increase in participation of historically underrepresented populations in clinical trials. That is the main focus. But there's another focus that's extremely important, and that is to increase the strength and generalizability of the evidence that is obtained from clinical trials so that it will focus and be correlated to those specific populations. So in essence, it's not only asking that we increase participation in clinical trials, but it's asking that we make sure that the study is applicable to that population.
Okay. Jeannie, can you tell us how this draft differs from previous diversity initiatives by the FDA?
Sure, thank you, and thanks for inviting me. So this draft was informed by an open public response period after it was published. The prior draft was published in April of 2022. And, since that time, you can clearly tell if you compare both the plans that this plan was informed by the public, patient organizations, public-private partnerships, CROs, and industry. And I think one of the big takeaways I got when I was comparing the drafts was that a couple of things. Number one, community engagement strategies are much more pronounced in the new diversity action plan. And this is captured specifically under measures to meet enrollment and retention strategies. And they recommend community engagement is enabled with patient organizations, navigators, which come in all different flavors, community-based organizations, faith-based organization. They also recommend cultural competency for clinical investigators and their staff. There is a call out, which is quite appropriate, to decrease the bias communication. I would say stop the bias communication. Provide language assistance to patients, provide assistance for people with disabilities, expand the clinical study eligibility criteria, pay for transportation, pay for dependent care, allow for flexible hours for study visits and reimbursement for out-of-pocket costs while patient partners, who they are, they're partners in research, while they're participating in a clinical trial. And I think that is the biggest difference between both the plans. I also do want to say that the FDA does a nice job in acknowledging disparities of care with certain intersectional groups. For example, low socioeconomic status groups, the LGBTQIA population, people with disabilities, women who are pregnant, and people with comorbidities. And different than the prior guidance, the FDA encourages the collection of sub-analyses in these population, in addition to focusing on primary enrollment targets of a representative population that, of course, includes diverse and ethnic populations. So I think those two things, to me, jumped out, that were pretty different in the plan. And I think that there's many more examples of what the definitions are that are in the documents. It expands on how something should be done. It gives examples. I'm very pleased that the FDA put out a new draft at this level of quality. Really well done.
Absolutely, absolutely. Elaine, can you tell us how sponsors or CROs support sites as we work together to meet these FDA guidelines?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you guys so much for having me. And Ms. Regnante, thank you for summarizing that so eloquently. I think I have to consider myself a trailblazer as it relates to the FDA guidance, because pivotal research was founded on this premise. So I previously worked as a CRA in the space, and so I would travel to different research sites, different academic centers. And back in 2016, I thought, wow, I don't see anyone that looked like me. I didn't see investigators that looked like me. I didn't see patients that looked like me, right? And so I came up with the idea that I wanted to start a clinical research site, and that my focus would be to bridge that gap and try to get more representation. So that's why I started Pivotal. So it's super exciting to see that the FDA has now, I like to think of it, they've caught up with me with this initiative. And so here we are a couple of years later. So I think it's super important. As a clinical research site, obviously, I look at us as we're the end users of this whole initiative, right? So when we talk about investigators and having trained investigators, having patients and making sure patients have access, obviously the sites, we're the ones who are implementing the clinical trial. So for us, this is super important. And so I know that, CROs and sponsors are super excited to have this guidance. And so for sites, certainly, we're looking forward to collaborating with the sponsors and the CROs to what you talk about, Jeannie, in terms of the making sure the stipend align with the expectations. I mean, we have some clinical trials where patients come in and they're literally in the clinic for 8 hours. Now, that's a whole day. And so the FDA guidance to making sure that we consider that we, patients are compensated fairly for what they're doing. I think that's great. Making sure they have travel allowance. Research patients should never have to come out of their pocket to pay to participate in clinical research. So I'm really looking forward to that. And then obviously I'm looking forward to, especially, I'm a minority, I own a site. A lot of our patient demographics are patients that look like us. So I'm looking forward to continuing to educate our patients so they understand the FDA guidance and that they understand the reason why we need to be represented in this space.
Absolutely. Dr. Randall, how do you foresee the FDA, or I guess I could toss this up to the both of you, how do you foresee the FDA measuring the success of this plan?
Well, I think there are a number of ways, but one specifically is that on an annual basis, all of the plans will be aggregated and they will need to be presented or submitted to Congress, and they'll also be on the website of FDA, so that the outcomes, and particularly with regard to the demographic goals of trials, will be there for review on an annual basis. I think this will actually illuminate the goal. I think it will also make it much more likely that there's a broader participation in clinical trials, because both the sites and those who are encouraging their patients, and I'm speaking from the point of view of a clinician, can actually be reminded of just how impactful these changes can be made with regard to representation in clinical trials. So I think just having that strategy, but also having an annual review raises the level of importance of this whole goal.
Yeah. So Jade, I think of it in a different perspective as well. So when a clinical trial is conducted, the sponsors and the CROs, they're able to aggregate the data because they use what's called an electronic data capture system. Within that system, they can tell what percentage of patients, everyone's demographic, they can tell the age, they can tell the race, they can tell quite a few things. So part of something that they can do to ensure that they're capturing LGBTQ and that they're capturing all of this information that the FDA is asking for is to make sure that the EDC system is updated to ask for that information. And so, like Dr. Morgan said, when they go in and have an annual review, or when they submit to the FDA for a new drug application, then they can present their data to say, okay, we conducted a phase 3 of that 1,000 patients. 500 were women, and kind of provide that detailed type of data. And I think that would help them to be accountable and help the FDA to understand that they're meeting the objectives.
Certainly. Jeannie, can you give me an example of a strong diversity action plan versus a lazy one?
Well, I guess let me start with a lazy one. So to me, a lazy one has a community outreach plan that starts at the time of enrollment, with general descriptions of organizations, no real collaboration, and no specifics. Also the successful companies. Well, the reason why I say that is successful companies and CROs start working with the community a year in advance of FPI, first patient in. We really need to engage the community to talk about clinical trials and educate them about clinical trials and the hope and opportunity that it brings them and their community so researchers can learn about them. I mean, that takes time to do. So first we have to educate the community. We also should educate the community about genetic testing, biomarker testing, and eligibility for clinical trials. Also the rights that patients have when they're in a clinical trial, and the right to stop when they're enrolled in a clinical trial at any time. So we need to do that. I guess I kind of started going to the strong ones, but I think that a lazy plan really doesn't respect the amount of time it takes to really conduct trusted community engagement with patient partners, community partners, and navigators. So a strong diversity action plan, I think, would be reviewed and edited by patient organizations, navigators, and community leaders. It needs to be owned by them. It's for them, by them. It should be understandable and health literate. Anybody should be able to pick it up and understand it. It would include a real focus on standing up actual new clinical trial sites in the community where people live. We know most patients with chronic diseases, cancer included, hypertension, 85% of chronic diseases are cared for in the community. We know that that's a real challenge. So a great diversity action plan should document what those new sites are in the community where people live. And also it would document who are the diverse serving sites with a sustainable and authentic outreach plan. There's a mentor of mine, his name is Moon Chen. He's at UC Davis in California. He always said that better representation in clinical trials takes time, trust, and treasure. And a strong plan needs to include ample time, trusted partners, and appropriate treasure. And that's what needs to be in this plan.
Wow. I love that you hit on, some of the things that it takes to have a strong plan. Do you foresee any challenges with implementing this particular plan?
I think industry and CROs alike have been ready for this. They actually have been implementing this plan. The FDA has been asking for diversity action plans. We're all learning. I really think that the plan is, and the recommendations are clearer. I think the only challenge would come if company leadership didn't really have a true commitment with an appropriate budget to implement a great action plan. It really is about leadership within companies. The people in these jobs that are are in trial operations. They've learned a lot. They know what to do. I think that when they look up, the leadership in the organization really needs to understand that this is a change, and we need to give people the space, the budget, and the creativity and the time to make this plan really be sustainable for everybody.
Absolutely. Elaine, I saw you nodding your head.
Yeah, yeah, I agree fully. I think that the plan will be more successful when leaders, executives have a buy-in, right? So they have a vested interest. They believe that this is the right thing to do. I think, I'm a nurse, I practiced bedside nursing for a long time. And I remember seeing patients come in, they're on 4 different blood pressure medicine and their blood pressure is still 170 over 100, right? So we know that there's a need for diversity in clinical research so that these drugs can be tested on people who need them the most. So the leaders have to have a buy-in. They have to understand and believe that this is for the good of mankind, right? And hence create the budget to make this happen.
Absolutely. Dr. Morgan, how might this plan affect the approval process for new drugs and medical devices?
Well, I think that the plan is probably going to ultimately increase the percentage of those drugs that are approved, and also the drugs that focus upon the underrepresented populations. I think there's going to be an increased effort to sort of make a match, so to speak, in terms of the development as well as the approval of the drugs. And certainly the FDA goes out of its way to state that it makes recommendations, and it's not always the law. But I think that just the culture change is going to be extremely important. And so I think what's been said by my co-speakers is that as the community learns more about clinical trials and how you can actually be a part and what the beneficiaries may realize in clinical trials, there's a certain demand that's put upon the sponsors and on the pharmaceutical companies that are applying for new pharmaceutical approvals. And so I think it's just going to make the process better and more deliberate. But at the end of the day, I think there would be a greater percentage of approvals, and it may actually smooth out the approval process of new drugs and new devices. I'm an orthopedic surgeon, so I'm pretty focused on devices as well.
Absolutely. On the demand for the companies and sponsors and things like that, Jeannie, are there any specific incentives for companies to comply with the diversity requirements?
I really feel like they get to keep their job. That's what I feel. They, they basically get to have a complete application with their protocol that they submit so they can start their study in a timely manner for their new medicine or device. So their innovation can get to all the people. It's a requirement for all phase 3 studies for a new molecular entity or a new, application. But the one thing that is challenging to me is that the FDA did not make this a requirement for a drug which got approval, but it's now a new indication. So application for a new indication for an existing marketed drug, I think should be included in this proposal. This is just, to me, all phase 3 studies for a new drug is just tree chops here. In order to have real change, we have to do it everywhere all the time. Also, I have to say, it's an incentive in that it's an opportunity for companies to publicly share their diversity action plan and their progress transparently and openly. And the reason why I say that is because if they do that, and a lot of companies have shared their data in terms of their progress, in terms of ensuring more representative populations in their clinical trials. But when companies do that, it promotes public trust. And that is critical for healthcare and the development of innovations for everyone. And it's good business. So that's what I see as the incentive for companies.
And so you touched on the fact that companies have to, publicly state, their strategy or what their effort is going to be to increase diversity. Are there any other key strategies outlined in the plan to improve diversity in clinical trials?
Well, first of all, let me just clarify if I misstated, but it's recommended that they transparently disclose their diversity action plan on their website, right? So that's I think that is a real benefit. I don't know, do any of my colleagues have any recommendations on the answer to that question? Randall, Elaine?
Well,
so if I understand, okay, go ahead, doctor.
No, after you.
So if I understand the question correctly, you're asking if there are any direct guidance from the FDA. I'm sorry if I missed. Yeah. So yeah, there are quite a few, right? So they provided guidance that sponsors should. We talked a little bit about this before. Should consider stipend. Should consider protocol inclusion exclusion criteria. I also have had the privilege of working as a project manager as well as a clinical trial manager for some CROs and some sponsors. And historically, it was not uncommon to use a template, right, to create the protocol. And so the template may have something like, if the patient has HIV, they're excluded. Well, part of the FDA guidance basically mandates that sponsor CRO take a closer look at this protocol and ask yourself, why are we excluding HIV, right? Is this a drug that's metabolized by the liver? And so the FDA even, went a little further to help the sponsors and the CRO to take a deeper look at the protocol to make sure that the protocol isn't inadvertently excluding the population that we're trying to attract. Many protocols have a criteria that says a patient is excluded if their blood pressure is 140/90. Dr. Morgan, you can attest that automatically excludes many of our patients, right? So even at my clinic, we have to exclude a lot of patients. So those are some of the specific guidance, I think, that are helpful.
Yes, I think that the whole idea of what they call pull through in some of the clinical trials that can be affected by comorbidities almost to a fault, that hopefully with more impetus on the types of population studies that are necessary. And with these annual reports showing the evidence of how positive that can be in terms of enrollment in the trials, I think it will lessen the effect of comorbidities or suspected comorbidities.
Mhm.
So I also think that this is really kind of just the tip of the iceberg in terms of the approval of from
Absolutely. And to say that we're at the tip of the iceberg, I guess I'll open this
new
one up.
pharmaceutical.
Sorry, I think it cut out for a second there. Are you back? Can you hear us?
Yeah. Yes.
Perfect. Maybe it was me. Sorry about
No,
that.
no. I think I think I have some. I need
Yeah.
a doctor for the electronic doctor.
The Wi-Fi, yeah. No worries, no worries. And you touched on us being at the tip of the iceberg. I'll toss this one up to the group as well. Are there any specific areas that you believe the plan could be improved, or do you see anything missing?
You know, from a site perspective, I think what would be helpful, because when we talk about diversity, so say, for example, if a large pharma is doing a phase 3 and they're looking for 3,000 participants, right? There is no specific guidance as to what percentage of that 3,000 patient needs to be, you know, diverse, right? So I think maybe the plan could probably provide a suggested range. It doesn't have to say 15% or 20%, but maybe a suggested range, right? Because if you're doing a study on 3,000 participants and you only happen to have 2 minority and 2 persons from LGBTQ, or you really, you know, tipping the scale. So I think maybe if there was more guidance on a range, I think that would be helpful. What do you think, Jeannie?
Well, I think a range would be good. I think there are folks that have trouble understanding what representation is. And there's actually a tool on the National Health Council website that helps with defining representation. But, you know, representation could be prevalence, which we know is new cases, and current cases, and then incidence is new cases. And if you look at the FDA guidance, it says prevalence or incidence. Well, prevalence and incidence are 2 very different things, right?
Mm-hmm.
So that's one thing that's kind of, I agree with you, is just not clear. How is representation calculated? And also, the guidance does, though, give some guidance if there's no justification for what the representation should be, because there's no publications in this area or for this disease area that is under study. The guidance says go to the U.S. Census, recruit or enroll a population that's consistent with the U.S. Census. But I think the precision around what representation is for a given disease area under study is left to for the epidemiologists and the study monitors to opine on in collaboration with the FDA. And I think one of the things that the guidance does is that if somebody has a question or they don't know how to do something or they want to consult with the FDA, they're certainly open to that, because as we know, process and guidance only covers probably 75% of what's so, and there's always going to be questions outside of that because you have a particular situation that it doesn't work for. So those are some of my comments.
There have been 2 presentations from the FDA with the NMA and with Project Impact 2.0 with that.
Well, he was going to say something great. There he is.
The evolution of the FDA's thinking and actions with regard to diversity in clinical trials, and to see how that has evolved, I think is extremely important, because we've been trying to accomplish the same thing for the last 20 years, looking at the same percentages. And as involved with African Americans, certainly it's always at least trying to match the percentage in the population, whether that be 12, 13%. And it's usually about a half or a third of that for most clinical trials. But I think that the way that there is a lot more intent to describe exactly how this can occur and the pre-planning that's necessary for attaining diversity in clinical trials is going to be the key that makes the difference, because we've all known what the population is, and that hasn't really helped us. There have to be other strategies to really help to diversify clinical trials. And so I think looking at disease states, looking at prevalence, looking at demographics, looking at population statistics, and being very, very purposeful in terms of trying to make sure that that is a part of each and every new drug. It puts an onus on the pharmaceutical companies, but in the long run, I think there's going to be a greater success. And I think this data review will show the effectiveness. And the other thing that's going to happen is when people really understand that these steps have been taken by FDA to assure that new pharmaceutical agents are effective for the entire population, and statistically can be shown that that is the case, I think that's going to go a long way to increasing diversity in clinical trials. So I think really the FDA is to be commended, not only for changing course, but improving the course, even over the past 2 years.
Well,
And Janine brought up,
said, Randall.
yeah. I was going to also add, Janine, you brought up a great point earlier about genetic testing, right? So a lot of times the only way we're going to know, so for example, APOL1 gene, they're finding out now that it's more prevalent in folks from, African countries. And so if you're developing a drug that's supposed to treat that condition, then you obviously probably need to do some form of genetic testing so that you know the population that actually needs this treatment. And then so your clinical trials should focus more toward that population, right? Because if we know they're impacted the most. So I agree.
Absolutely. And Dr. Randall, you touched on, some of the progress that was made over the past 20 years and then over the past 2 years. How do you see this plan impacting the future of medical research and drug development, specifically with this plan? What do we see in the long run after following this plan or this action?
Well, I think I've spoken to what the ultimate success would look like, but getting there, I think, is going to require a lot more education for in the community, and more community-based activity for all forms of trials, whether it's community-based participatory research, whether it's surveys, whether there's focus groups, as well as obviously the standard pharmaceutical and device trials. So I think in the long run, we're going to see more engagement as a part of new pharmaceutical and agents and new devices. And it's going to change the way that participants are solicited. And but ultimately, I think it's going to make it more successful, because people have to see the advantage of genetics and the advantage of what happens when you take medications that are targeted to a disease that is represented differently for you than it is for others in the population. But in many cases, there's a positive outcome because of this work that's done. That there's nothing better than a good outcome to stimulate people to want to be involved. And I think we have tried in the NMA over the 20-21 years to increase physician involvement, but increase patient education in clinical trials. And I think we still haven't gotten to where we need to be, but that's really the only way. It's not going to be done only by one segment of this very complex team.
Agreed.
Well said. Could I ask Dr. Randall a question?
For sure.
What do you think? Well, could you share with me your perspective on the importance of, or not, of primary care physicians, GYNs, urologists, understanding why it might be important to encourage their patients to have a choice around clinical trials, and where are we now and how far do we need to go?
Well, we're not where we need to be, that's for sure, because a lot of times those physicians, and particularly in primary care, that are in locations where they're in constant contact with trials and CROs and the like, are exposed more to it, or they're stimulated to expose their patients, encouraged to. But those other practices that may be rural, or they may be, one doc trying to keep things together, and they're not going to be recruited. So therefore, their patients are not going to be given the opportunity to make the choice. And so that's why I mentioned looking more at communities, so that there's another way that everybody can be more exposed to clinical trials, so that it's not just on the clinician alone, or just on the pharmacist alone, or it's inculcated within the community. But certainly we as physicians have to do a better job of sharing the positive outcome of participation in clinical trials with patients, as well as the superior medical care that they obtain during the time they're in the trial, and the fact that that information then comes back to their treating doctor, so that there's a harmonious pathway. It's not like, segmented, well, you go there and get this, we never know what occurred when you were in this trial. No, we're your advocate, and you're making certainly a difference, not only for yourself, but for our future patients. And so I think it has to be more. It really has to be more of a community effort. I know it sounds kind of like basketball or something, but it does really, I think, have to be that. It's not going to work otherwise.
Mm-hmm. So may I add something to this as well? So Janine, so I own a clinical research site, and I know a lot of my colleagues own clinical research sites. What we find is that a lot of physicians really do want to try to participate in clinical trials. However, it's a huge undertaking. So if you don't have the experience, if you don't have the skill set, if you don't have the staff, you're just not even going to think about that. So myself, as well as a lot of my colleagues who own clinical research sites, what we do is what we call an embedded model. So say, for example, I have a dermatologist right now. She's in Atlanta. She wants to participate in research. She really doesn't have a ton of experience, but super excited and super engaged. So what I do, I send my team to her facility to conduct clinical trials from her facility. So what that does, it gives her the opportunity to learn, gives her team the opportunity to learn, and it gives her patients the opportunity to have this as a treatment option, an option, care option for her patients. So I think this model is a model that's going to help our communities. And I really would, love to continue to discuss this with our CROs and sponsors, because a lot of the time when you explain this, it kind of doesn't make sense to them, but it makes a ton of sense to us, because this model really works, and it gives those physicians, like you said, who wouldn't otherwise think about this, to have the opportunity to participate.
Elaine, I'm sorry. Elaine, I'd love to continue on with that and kind of talk about some of those long-term benefits of, sites, sponsors, and CROs working together on the initiative.
Yeah, the huge long-term benefit that I see is better care, hopefully, for people, right? So if we have more devices, more drugs that are geared to treating the appropriate population, then hopefully, when patients go to the doctor, they can be prescribed a medication that's going to be effective for their disease condition, right? So then your poor grandmother doesn't have to take 6 pills for his or her, for her blood pressure, when she could take 1 or 2, right? So I see that as a huge benefit. I also see the benefit of our future generation being engaged in clinical trials. So from the providers to the study coordinators to the research assistant to the data entry person. So there is a whole team of people at the site level that work together to execute clinical research, right? And so with this initiative, I see more people getting trained, more people understanding our communities, getting more engaged, having more knowledge, be better informed, so they can make decisions. So I think those are all great outcomes.
Absolutely.
Jade, if I could just mention, just in reviewing the guidelines and the draft guidelines, just brought to my mind that it's kind of like a little textbook in clinical trials of today. What now makes up this ecosystem of clinical trials, and the responsibilities and the certain amount of education that you need to even participate. And so somehow I think that education needs to be a part of our education system in medical schools, and certainly in many of our societies, where we're very intentional about clinical trials and very intentional about the role that the FDA is playing to make the trials more effective, more available, and more consistent. So I think there's a lot really to learn, and you'll find that most of the doctors that are in newer doctors, in particular, who are in practice, and so in a place where they control their patient flow. If they work for another company or something, many times they don't even have the opportunity to participate unless they really step up and request it. But if you're educated and you understand the importance, you also understand the financial benefits of participation in clinical trials. I think that is going to make a big difference.
It's amazing to see that, the FDA is stepping up and, implementing guidelines to increase diversity. So how can companies work to overcome some of that historical distrust that Black Americans have in clinical trials to reach the goals of the action plan? Jeannie, I'll pass that one to you.
Wow. Well, I think we need to respect history and patients and people's perspective of history. And I think there's a lot of education that needs to go on within companies, clinical trial teams, operations teams, outreach leaders, to understand how to talk to people and also how to just listen. I think that's really important. I also believe that focusing on distrust and barriers blames the patient. we have to stop. We have to stop focusing on all the papers that are written, focusing on all the barriers about why people don't participate. We need to focus on what works. And I think the Diversity Action Plan, as you clearly stated and eloquently stated, Randall, that it is a kind of a short book on how to do it and what works. I do think that companies, all types of companies and all leaders need to build the ecosystem. We need to build trust. Clearly, the system is broken. We've been talking about this for 20 years. We need to ask the patient for their experience before, during, and after clinical trials. For example, if these participant partners that we work to engage in a clinical trials they feel they're not respected, or they feel that bias has been placed on them, then the sponsor shouldn't use that site. No more. No excuses for biased behavior and communications. I feel that we need to really do some thinking about how it is that we're building the system to be what it needs to be. I also think that there needs to be a concerted effort, and Dr. Randall pointed this out also, that the trials need to be placed in the community. We need to build the ecosystem. Yes, we need to train the investigators, but we need to put clinical trial access where patients live. And decentralized clinical trials are never going to get us all the way there. So we need to, put new sites in the community where people live, and we need to ensure representation for all types of studies, everywhere, all the time, every day. I often think about this, when you challenge different people on different notions that they have, volunteers, healthy volunteers for early studies. That vision doesn't put in your mind a healthy Black woman. But quite frankly, if you ask a healthy Black woman to be in a clinical trial, she will say yes. But we need to ask her. And we also need to let study participants tell their own story. They will make their new history. They need to tell their story. Sponsors and industry shouldn't talk about how great they're doing. Let the patients tell the story. They will say whether or not we got there. I always say that it's not health equity until the patient says so. And we also need to be very deliberate in leaving something meaningful behind when we conduct a clinical study in the community, and thank people for their contribution to science. It all matters.
Absolutely. I love that quote. It's not health equity until the patient says so. If you see that on Black Twitter, just know I got that from you.
Great. I like it.
Yeah.
Dr. Morgan, were you going to add?
Well, I think I sort of laid out my plan for equity. But again, it's the education that's really important. And at this point, forced education in medical schools, where there's always too much curriculum now to teach anything because there's already too much to learn. But this is extremely important. And whether it's in the public health curriculum, or whether it's in internal medicine or family medicine, it should be somewhere that we understand, even the definitions. Elaine has gone through and explained so much about what the CROs do. But who are all the players, and how can you be involved at various levels? How can you be involved maybe more than one or two levels? And we're not going to increase participation unless we understand what it is we aspire to do. And so I would challenge the CROs to unify and provide more education about what actually goes on. I hear about CROs, it's like, oh yeah, they do these things, but they're very important things. And I think the average physician is not really very much attuned to what's going on in the CRO. The final
Yeah.
point is that the testimony of patients who have been in clinical trials, or the patients whose lives have been saved because of focused, precision type treatment, or new trials, is paramount, particularly in the African American community. It's just absolutely paramount, and I'm not sure that
Yeah.
we take advantage of that.
Mhm. Yeah. May I add, so two things I thought of. So in terms of the, how can the sponsors and the CRO helps to minimize the distress? I often hear the community say, we feel like they come in and they take and they leave, right? And so, as we've talked about earlier, it's about building that relationship. It's about getting into the community, like Janine mentioned, that year 2 before you even think about your clinical trial. One of the very large pharma company, I really commend them right now. They went into Africa and they're doing testing on people, women for breast cancer. And their whole motive is doing this and not asking for anything in return, but giving. So in the African American community, where there is already, some communities where there's already so much distrust, I encourage the farmers and the CROs come in, garner that relationship, get to know the people in the community, and then come with your ask, because the community look at it that if you're coming in today and tomorrow you're coming with an ask, that's not building a relationship. The other thing I think is that a lot of patients feel that when they participate in clinical trials, they never know what the results of the clinical trials are. So I think we need to do a better job, when possible, to share those results with the participants, especially if they were participating in a study that they were taking a placebo or a dummy drug versus the study drug. Share that information with them so that they can understand and they can feel that closure. So I think those two things would add value.
Absolutely. Well, as our conversation comes to a close, I want to thank you all so much for participating in this very vital conversation and sharing your insights. I really hope that we can all continue to work together toward a future where health equity is a reality for all of us. And thank you all for joining us this evening. We will see you next time on blackdoctor.org.
Okay.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, everyone. I
Good night.
appreciate it.
Bye.
Good night. Good night, Jade.
Good night.